Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the first York Circle at Home lecture series for 2021-2022. This year's theme is titled, "O Canada, the True North Strong and Free, a historical journey through Canada's transgressions of individual and community rights." Today's lecture topic is Not Canadian Enough, the realities of race, gender, and sexual identity politics and immigration. Welcome. My name is Carrie Williams, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Events at York University. It is my responsibility to acknowledge the land I am on. Because we're not all gathered together on campus, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. However, it is also your responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on. And the website native-land.ca is a very good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and it is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably care and share for the Great Lakes region. My decision to acknowledge the land is one of my first steps on the road towards reconciliation, the learning and unlearning towards reconciliation. I'd like to give you a quick update, and if this is your first event with us in Alumni Engagements in September, a very warm welcome to the academic year. I'm happy to share that York partially reopened our campuses last month. Many of the activities we've missed over the last 19 months, from in-person classes to extracurricular activities to just getting together to chat, have actually resumed. Our most up-to-date university planning information can always be found at our Better Together website, which is at yorku.ca/bettertogether. Now, if at any time you need help with today's experience or have questions about the content, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Our team is ready to help you. And as always, the presentation will be recorded and then later upgraded or uploaded to our YouTube channel for you to share and view later. That same button may be used to submit questions for our guest speakers to answer during the Q&A period following their lectures. As many questions as time permits will be posed to our panelists. All of your questions and comments are visible to all of our panelists and staff working behind the scenes, so we ask you to keep your comments relevant and respectful. Before we get to the lectures, we do like to get to know our audience a bit by a quick poll. It should come up on your screen now. Today's question is how you would rate your knowledge regarding the topic around immigration. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic? I'll just give everybody a moment to respond. It's always helpful for ourselves, but more importantly, our speakers to understand who's in the audience and what knowledge you're bringing to the space. Okay, thank you for sharing that. So just under 60% feel somewhat informed, 15% high, and we have a good amount of people who are here really to learn about the topic from the beginning. So thank you very much for that. It's very helpful. Now I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce the chair and host of this series, Dr. Rebecca Pillai Riddell, Associate Vice President Research and Academic Chair of the York Circle. Dr. Pillai Riddell is a professor in the Faculty of Health. Hi, Rebecca. In 2018, York's Faculty of Graduate Studies honored her with the faculty's teaching award for her achievements in graduate teaching and supervisory excellence. Additionally, Dr. Pillai Riddell is a pediatric pain researcher and clinical psychologist at the Hospital for Sick Children here in Toronto. An acclaimed researcher, she leads the OUCH Lab, which stands for Opportunities to Understand Childhood Hurt, and where she seeks to reduce pain in child health. Welcome, Dr. Pillai Riddell. It's always a pleasure to have you, and I look forward to you leading today's discussion.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm very excited this morning. It's a beautiful Sunday morning, and I am actually, for the first time in over a year, greeting York Circle audience from my office in Kenneth Tower on the York University campus. So I think a testament, I love being vaccinated, and I think that this is a lot of, you can really feel in the air that the world is opening up again after some really challenging times. So as Carrie said, I am the academic chair of the York Circle series, and it's been my pleasure to help us pivot and try and figure out how we are going to engage with our audience in this new virtual format. And so during the pandemic, we started this new way to capitalize on the diverse strengths of York's researchers, from policymakers to molecular scientists, to engage our audience in the intersection of ideas against specific topics related to the pandemic. And because this new format was so well received, we've decided to continue it for this year, bringing together multidisciplinary panelists to dissect and discuss 4 themes over 4 sessions throughout the 21-22 academic year. This time it's within the context of Canada's history. This series today, this workshop is being co-hosted with our, or all of our workshops this year or symposium are actually being co-hosted with our organized research units. And so we've gone to our centers of excellence in research really on campus. And in this particular one today, this Sunday, is the Center for Refugee Studies. So today's first topic on this series is titled Not Canadian Enough: The Realities of Race, Gender, and Sexual Identity Politics in Immigration. Our first speaker, Professor Ali Kazimi, will present on the systematic legacies of the Komagata Maru and its encounter with white Canada. Professor David A.B. Murray will share some of his ethnographic research with sexual orientation and gender identity refugee claimants in Toronto. And finally, Professor Lewin Goldring will discuss how do refugee claimants, those who seek asylum in Canada, fit into the broader picture of Canadian policies regarding refugees, immigrants, temporary workers, and residents. I'm so pleased that Ali, David, and Lewin could join us today. I know you're going to learn so much from their presentation. Now I'll introduce our first speaker, Professor Ali Kazimi. Professor Kazimi is a filmmaker, a writer, a visual artist whose work deals with race, social justice, migration, history, memory, and archive. In 2019, he received the Governor General's Award for Visual and Media Arts, as well as a Doctor of Letters, honoris causa, from the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Professor Kazimi. I think your camera, would you like to turn on?
I think I'm getting a message the host has stopped it.
We will check that out behind the scenes.
And here we go. I think we're on.
There we go. Welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for that. And it's wonderful to be here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So off we go. I'm going to share my screen. So I want to introduce you to an event that it's likely that most of you don't know about. It's called the Komagata Maru incident in Canada, and I'm using scare quotes for it, and you'll see why. And let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I came to Canada in 1983 as a film student to study at a very prestigious program right here in York University. I arrived with a colleague, and we landed in Toronto in August 1983, and the immigration officer interrogated us for 20 minutes in a separate room and then said to us, "The only reason I'm letting you into my country is because you speak such good English." And then he said, "And you'll always remember me." So I do. I don't remember what he looked like. I don't remember his name, but I do remember what he said. And what he said was actually a gift. It set me on a path to figure out a simple question, which is, if Canada is such a inclusive, multicultural country and is celebrated for it, why is its population mainly white and of European descent? And this question, the exploration of this question, took me to something that connected, a part of Canadian history that connected to India. And this is known, as I said before, the Komagata Maru incident, in which this ship, the Komagata Maru, carrying 376 would-be immigrants from India, arrived in Vancouver on May 23rd, 1914. And Canada did something quite different and precedent-setting with this ship and its passengers. So the ship was allowed to come into Canadian waters. In fact, it was allowed to come into Vancouver Harbor, but it was forced to anchor a kilometer from shore. So in many ways, what Canada was demonstrating by this very theatrical epic gesture is that you can come in, but landing would be a completely different matter. And this is what the passengers and would-be immigrants were about to find out. So I spent about 8 years trying to make this film, which was eventually released in 2004, a film called Continuous Journey. And then in 2011, I published a book called Undesirables, White Canada and the Komagata Maru. The title for the book was deliberately, the subtitle I should say, was deliberately provocative, because I wanted to draw attention to something that most Canadians are unaware of, which is that Canada, from the time of Confederation, 1867 to 1968, had a policy, an immigration policy that was based on race. Till about 1948, there was a series of policies and legislations, regulations, and practices that effectively defined Canada as a white country. And this notion of whiteness was repeated. There was no judgment attached to it, no embarrassment. And Canadian politicians use the phrase Canada being a white man's country, or the notion of white Canada quite often in public debates, in the House of Commons, and so on. So part of this collective policy was how it dealt with immigrants from British India. And remember, this is at a time in the early 20th century when Canada is advertising and indeed competing for immigrants with Australia and New Zealand, immigrants from Europe, and they are being offered 160 acres of free land to settle in Western Canada. South Asians from British India started arriving around in 1904, and over 4 years, by 1908, there are 5,000 immigrants from India, almost all men, with the exception of a handful of women. And this causes tremendous panic. These Hindus, as South Asians were then called, were seen as a moral, political, and an overall threat to Canada. But Canada could do nothing about them, really, because British India was part of the British Empire, as was Canada, and imperial subjects were supposed to have the right to move around the empire, and were guaranteed equality and British fair play and justice. And the Komagata Maru would prove that this was not true. In 1907, there was a race riot in Vancouver that led to Chinese and Japanese businesses being attacked, but the outcome of the race riot was a one-person commission that was set up. And the commission, the man who led the commission said that Canada must remain a white man's country is seen necessary on moral and political grounds. Oops. And that man was William Lyon Mackenzie King. He was a deputy minister of labor at the time, and he formulated a very simple regulation in order to deal with immigrants from British India. And the regulation, which was in addition to the Immigration Act, said all immigrants must come by continuous journey from their country of birth or citizenship. A seemingly innocuous, neutral statement, but enacted in a very particular way. So Canadian Pacific ran a very successful shipping line between Calcutta and Vancouver. It was forced to stop selling tickets to, it was forced so that it stopped selling tickets to people from India. And then immigration officers on the East Coast got worried, and they wanted to know, how does this apply to European immigrants, most of them who were not coming by continuous journey? And in a secret memo, it was described, it was stated that this, you must understand this applies to only the most undesirable of all immigrants. And of course, that was considered, that everybody knew, it was an open secret that this applied to only the so-called Hindus. So in 1914, when the Komagata Maru arrives, this is the headline in the Vancouver papers. The passengers are quite determined. I think I left out one step. So the way the application of the continuous journey regulation is so absolute that immigration from India dries up. And since it was no longer possible to come by a continuous journey, those who tried to arrive through a third country were deported. So a man by the name of Gurdat Singh, who's there in the white suit there, charters a Japanese steamer and challenges the continuous journey regulation. The ship is surrounded by armed guards who patrol night and day. No one is allowed to come on board. There's no contact with the community, and the passengers are denied all contact with the press. Medical examinations that would normally take a few seconds for European immigrants are stretched out. So for the entire ship, it takes 8 days for the passengers to be examined. And then the process of processing the passengers is also strung out, and it goes on for weeks. The immigration officials don't give a judgment on the passengers, because they know that as soon as they do, the passengers have the right to go to court. And the last thing the government of Canada wants to do is for these passengers to go to court, because as the MP from Vancouver says, we would go to the courts if only we could find a court to go to. There is very little trust in the courts, because some judges have actually ruled against the constitutionality of barring immigrants from Asia. The community on shore hires the only lawyer who will represent them, a remarkable man called Edward Bird. And Bird is not allowed to go on the ship, nor is he allowed direct access of any kind to the passengers. All his letters to the ship are opened by immigration officers. Essentially, there's no legal right to counsel and no lawyer-client privilege, and no access to media. Eventually, the passengers do manage to get to court, and the court rules against them. The British Columbia Court of Appeal rules that Canada essentially does have the right to discriminate against fellow British subjects on the basis of race. On July 23rd, the ship is sent back, accompanied by one of the two Canadian naval ships, the HMCS Rainbow. Now, this pattern repeats itself. I think most of you would know about the MS St. Louis, which was a ship carrying German Jewish refugees that Canada refused to accept in 1939. And of course, these refugees were fleeing from Nazi Germany. But in 1948, a curious thing happens. Another chartered ship arrives, another irregular arrival of a passenger ship, and this time it's the MS Walnut. It's a ship carrying white European immigrants, all from Baltic countries, fleeing the Soviet invasion of their land. And in this case, the passengers are welcomed. This event is celebrated, and in fact, the government goes beyond the rule of law. It individually reassesses the Immigration Act of the time and makes exception for every passenger to give them immediate immigrant status. I'm going to jump way forward now. So in 2002, Canada signed something called the Safe Third Country Agreement. Now, this agreement to me echoes the continuous journey regulation. It basically says that any refugee claimant must come directly to Canada. If they come via the United States, they have to seek refuge in the US, and they cannot apply for refugee status in Canada. And Canada, on the other hand, makes it impossible for refugees to come to Canada because of a process called interdiction. This process of interdiction was started during the time of the continuous journey regulation, where immigration officials are sent to the port of departure or the airport of departure, and they pre-assess the passengers before they were to board their ship. And in this case, passengers are vetted not only at passport control in the country that they're departing from, but also at the gate of any Canadian aircraft. So virtually almost no refugees can come through this method, and most of them come through the US. But when refugees do try and come to Canada by what are known as irregular means, such as the Tamil refugees who arrived on the ship, the MV Sunsein, in 2010, Canada then again uses all its power to make its laws more plastic. So in the case of the MV Sunsein, the ship is taken to CFP Esquimalt, where a few things happens. Esquimalt emerges turns into a twilight zone for these refugees, is designated as being in Canada, but only as a special port of entry type, a bubble zone. And there's no right to counsel within this bubble zone, even though they're detained in Canadian soil and the Charter of Rights should apply to everybody. There's no access to the media. They cannot get their story out to the public. And so the strategy of the state is to deter, deport, and make extremely difficult for refugees to arrive and to discourage those arriving on its shore. Now, many of you are aware of a new phenomena that's happened in terms of refugees coming to Canada. So in order to bypass the Safe Third Country Agreement, much like the passengers of the Komagata Maru, refugees have found a way that gets them around this agreement. The agreement they discovered applies only to regular border crossings. So these are border crossings that have Canadian and American border posts, but it doesn't apply to other border crossings, of which there are thousands across the border. And one of these border crossings is in upstate New York, a place called Roxham Road, and Quebec. And so over 50,000 and more refugees have entered Canada through this border crossing, at which the Safe Third Country Agreement doesn't apply. Now, I'll just wrap up by saying, when I gave a presentation like this at a different university, I had a man come up to me. He was Iranian, and he said, "What you've said is my lived experience." He couldn't get into into the US or Canada. He got on a flight to Mexico, then made the dangerous journey across the border. And he said, I hired a cab in Texas to drive me all the way to Buffalo. And there he made his refugee claim, which was, fortunately for him, accepted, and he was allowed to come in. So I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Professor Kazimi, for that insightful presentation and taking us all the way from our historical legacies until today. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Professor David A.B. Murray. Drawing on theoretical interests in culture, nationalism, colonialism, representation, performance, and queer theory, Professor Murray has conducted fieldwork in Caribbean, New Zealand, and in the Caribbean, New Zealand, and Canada, examining sexual and gender minorities and their relations to local, national, and transnational social, political, and economic forces. He is the author of several books, including Real Queer, Sexual Orientation, and Gender Identity Refugees in the Canadian Refugee Apparatus, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2015. He's also the editor of Homophobia, Lust and Loathing Across Time and Space, published by Duke University Press in 2009, and Queering Borders, Language, Sexuality, and Migration by John Benjamin's Publishing, 2016. Professor Murray is currently engaged in a research project focusing on how people living with HIV/AIDS are navigating end of the AIDS discourses in Toronto, Canada, and Bridgetown, Barbados. Professor Murray, thank you for joining us. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Riddell, and good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for this invitation to speak with you. I'm just going to share my screen. And hopefully that's working. I'm talking, well, I hope you'll see there are some continuities in what I'm talking about in relation to what Dr. Kazimi just presented. And yes, I'll look forward to hearing your comments or questions afterwards. I'm focusing on refugees as well, but a different category of refugees. And I'm going to be speaking about sexual orientation and gender identity refugees, or what are known as SOGI refugees. So since the early 1990s, Canada has become a primary destination for individuals who make refugee claims based on their sexual orientation or gender identity persecution. Many of these refugees arrive in one of Canada's three major cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, where they lodge their claim and await a decision. When I was conducting research on this topic in the mid-2010s, the vast majority of SOGI refugee claimants were from Caribbean or African nations, but there were also claimants from Latin America, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Now, throughout the 2010s, there was also quite a bit of media coverage in the Canadian mainstream and LGBT media on SOGI refugees. I think I have an example of, this is the kind of coverage you might see sometimes. In much of this media coverage, Canada was regularly identified as a leader in LGBT rights and a haven for LGBT individuals from around the world seeking protection from violence, persecution, and discrimination. And by the mid-2010s, the Canadian government itself was proclaiming Canada to be a proud defender of LGBT rights around the globe. Now, as I read these articles, I noticed a common narrative theme. LGBT refugees' countries of origin were regularly depicted as deeply homophobic. So the refugees had no chance but to flee and seek refuge in Canada, where they were now thankful to find freedom and protection. I call this the queer migration to liberation nation narrative. And in that narrative, you see how sort of sexual, gender, and national identities and cultures are put together in a storyline to demonstrate how a particular formation of sexual citizenship is now operating as a cornerstone of what it is to be Canadian. But after spending about 18 months working with SOGI refugee claimants in Toronto and volunteering with 2 refugee support groups in the early 2010s, I realized there were a number of omissions, silences, and gaps in the queer migration to liberation nation narrative, which raised a number of questions for me. How do SOGI refugee claimants navigate the Immigration and Refugee Board, the IRB, which is in charge of making decisions about refugee claims in Canada? What is their experience of the IRB? Are all SOGI refugee claimants successful? If not, why are some claims getting rejected? And then on a broader scale, I was interested in how sexual orientation and gender identity are now these crucial components of immigration citizenship policies. And I wanted to examine their effects on people who are trying to cross national borders. So to answer these questions, I spent time with refugee claimants in Toronto as they moved through the refugee determination process, from the moment they lodged a claim for asylum, often at Pearson Airport, until after they received the decision on that claim. And I discovered that one of the many hurdles faced by all refugee claimants is proving their claim to be credible to the IRB. So for many refugee claimants in Canada, proving credibility is done at a hearing, which resembles a court case where the refugee claimant, their lawyer, and an IRB member or board member meet for anywhere from 1 to 5 hours to review and assess the claim. That's a drawing from the Government of Canada as to what a hearing room looks like. Just to give you a bit of an image of what they're experiencing. So the IRB member acts sort of much like a judge. They are interrogating the refugee claimant's story to see whether A, the claimant is credible, that is, they are the person who they say they are. B, their story is credible. In other words, what happened really happened. And C, whether they meet the threshold of refugee credibility, that is, they meet an international definition of persecution based, in this case, on their membership in a social group. So what I found fascinating and sort of deeply troubling was the way in which the refugee determination process required many of the claimants to prove that first criteria, that is, they are who they say they are. In other words, this category of refugees have to demonstrate that they are credibly gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. And as more than one refugee claimant said to me, how do I prove I'm gay? So based on this question, much of my fieldwork focused on the ways in which refugee claimants, their lawyers, and LGBT service workers create files that are full of documents that help prove that claimant's gay or lesbian identity, how they learned to tell a particular narrative about being a SOGI refugee, and in some cases, how they learned to perform in the hearing, all of which will hopefully persuade the IRB member who's assessing this claim. I don't have time to give you examples of all the different components of the refugee claim process and these different aspects of it. So I'm just going to focus on one, documents. Documentation caused a great deal of stress for many SOGI refugee claimants as they were trying to amass the documents to send to the IRB that would then assess the claim. When they were looking for information on what documents to submit to help prove their credibility as a gay or lesbian person, the IRB website wasn't much help at the time. It stated, quote, "You must give us documents to support your claim, along with identity documents. You can submit other documents that you feel are relevant to your claim, including proof of membership in a political organization, medical or psychological reports, police documents, business records, news clippings, visas, and travel documents," unquote. So for most of the SOGI refugee claimants I worked with, questions arose over what other documents relevant to their claim would help substantiate or verify their sexual orientation. Now, when refugee lawyers came to speak to a SOGI support group meeting in Toronto that I was attending, they spent a significant amount of time addressing this issue. One lawyer said to the group that, quote, "You have to have proof of your life as gay," unquote. And he would urge his clients to join LGBT groups in Toronto, like the 519 Community Center, the Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention, or Supporting Our Youth, an LGBT organization for people under 25. According to him, all of these Toronto-based organizations provided great support and good proof of your orientation, and could be viewed as evidence that the claimant was participating in their community and establishing a new life in Canada. Other forms of documentation were discussed as well, including letters from friends and family members back home, photocopies of profiles from gay dating websites, photographs of the claimant with their romantic partner, or photos of them participating at Toronto Pride Parade. That's a photo from a news article, but that's, some of you may remember this. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2016 joined the Pride Parade, and beside him at one point was this young man who was identified as a gay Syrian refugee. However, one lawyer did say that while photos could be helpful, a single photo of a claimant watching the Pride Parade with friends was not going to work. As the lawyer said, quote, "I'm gay 365 days a year, not just one. You must show how your life is this way every day," unquote. At some of these meetings, successful refugee claimants, those who've gone through the hearing and had a positive decision, they would endorse the lawyer's comments, and they would note that they'd been asked questions about these kinds of documents by the board member at their hearing. And they would endorse submitting a whole range of documents, news articles, personal photos, letters. One claimant told me how she had coached her grandmother back in St. Lucia on what to write about in the letter and what incidents to include or not. And a number of claimants at these support group meetings would use their smartphones to take pictures of themselves with support group leaders or visiting LGBT speakers after the meetings, and those photos would be submitted to their lawyers. However, submitting lots of photos and documents didn't guarantee that a board member would automatically view the claimant's SOGI identity as credible. In fact, these documents could sometimes end up as sites of interrogation at the hearing, and they become another form of questioning and possibly doubting the claimant's credibility. At some of the hearings I attended, board members asked refugee claimants a series of questions based on their letters that often tested the claimant's knowledge about the content of the letter. For example, when one claimant submitted a letter written by the facilitator at a Toronto SOGI refugee support group, confirming that the claimant had been regularly attending meetings, the board member asked questions about the location, the date, and the time of the meeting, and the name of the coordinator. Now, most refugee claimants would answer these questions quite easily, but at this hearing, the claimant couldn't remember the facilitator's full name. He could only remember their first name, nor could he remember exactly how he traveled from his home in the Toronto suburbs to the support group meeting. The board member had asked him to recreate his travel route, and he couldn't remember the names of specific subway stops or intersections where he boarded the streetcar. The hearing resulted in a negative decision. And although it was likely due to a number of issues with the claimant's testimony, his inability to accurately respond to the board member's questions based on a letter, that document, likely contributed to the member's decision that his claim was not credible. Now, in my book, I argue that these and other examples of the difficulties in proving SOGI credibility demonstrate that the Canadian government's claim to support LGBT rights in Canada and around the globe is problematic. As long as SOGI refugee claimants produce the right documents, answer questions in a way that satisfies the board member and fits the board member's assumptions of what the story of a persecuted LGBT person from another country should look and sound like, then they will likely receive a positive decision and start their journey towards obtaining Canadian citizenship. However, for those claimants who do not perform or conform to the board members' perceptions of what a credible SOGI refugee and their story should look and sound like, or for those claimants who cannot produce adequate documentation proving their identity or persecution based on their membership in this particular social group, the risk of rejection, incarceration, or deportation is very high. So this points to some troubling questions for the Canadian refugee determination process and the international refugee apparatus more generally, which are premised on being able to separate a real from a fake refugee. How does one determine what is real and what is fake? How does one, or whose definitions are being applied? How might techniques of assessment reproduce or impose belief systems that contain problematic assumptions about cultural, racial, gender, or sexual differences? Rather than focusing on the differences between real and fake refugees, perhaps our governments should be examining more how they initiate or participate in economic and military activities that forcibly displace people from their homelands, and how they might work towards eradicating those practices to produce more equitable and peaceful global relationships. Perhaps we should also be re-examining our immigration system as a whole for the ways in which it works to facilitate entry for particular groups based on racial, gender, sexual, or economic privilege, while it creates increasingly high barriers for those who do not have the privilege of wealth, education, and/or a particular passport. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Murray, for such an enlightening talk. Something I really don't need to know a lot about coming into this. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Professor Lillian Goldring. Dr. Goldring is a professor of sociology at York University. Her interests include non-citizenship, citizenship, and belonging, differential inclusion, and immigrants with precarious work. Currently, she's involved in collaborative research on the relationship between precarious immigration trajectories and precarious work, and the experiences of illegalized migrants during the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Professor Goldring. Please take the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. And again, I want to thank you, Dr. Riddell, for the invitation and all of the team behind this. And it's lovely to be here with this audience today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation as well. So as the title suggests, I'm really interested in the relationship between migration and immigration policy having to do with refugees and others, and people's experiences and how that relates to social inequality in Canada. And I'm going to be addressing some questions that are related to this. And I've been particularly interested in thinking about the experiences of people that arrive in various temporary situations, not as recognized immigrants, but in temporary situations. When I started working on this topic about 15 years ago, most Canadians assumed that things like undocumented or illegalized migrants were something that was present or an issue in the United States and not here. That's been changing a little bit, but I've been doing work in this area now. And I use, okay, so let me move on to my agenda. I'm going to be focusing a little bit more today on a question that the other two speakers have also been addressing one way or another, which has to do with how policies that are meant to offer protection become racialized and gendered, and in this way and in other ways contribute to producing and reproducing social inequality. So it's always good to know, to take a look at other research to know, what we know and what we don't know about the experiences of immigrants and how they relate to social inequality. and how policies help to contribute to this, and how social relations help to contribute to social inequality. We, I think, are very familiar with the issues of credential misrecognition and non-recognition for immigrants. We know about overly qualified people driving taxis, working as PSWs, as personal support workers instead of nurses or doctors sometimes. We're quite aware of this when it comes to people who arrive as permanent residents. What is less well understood is about the experiences of people who arrive without permanent residence and how they fare in the long term. And this is something that I've been interested in looking at for some time. And I just want to underscore that if I use the term illegalized, I'm referring to people who have been criminalized and made illegal by the way they're treated and by Canadian policies around immigration and deportation, not because any person is illegal. You may have heard that slogan, "No one is illegal," and I certainly am on board with that. Now, why is it important to consider the experiences of people who arrive without permanent residence in Canada? You might say, well, they're not really immigrants. Why should we think of them as immigrants whose experiences should be examined? Well, there are several reasons. One, whoops, there we go. One reason is that the number of temporary entries to Canada has been climbing tremendously over the last 20, 25 years. This slide only shows you the entrance in 2019, and things have certainly changed since then with the pandemic. In particular, temporary workers have been able to come, but humanitarian entries at the border have stopped. The general point is that one reason to be interested in the experiences of people who arrive initially as temporary is because there are so many more of these people. We now have what scholars and policymakers refer to as a two-step immigration system, where many of the people that we think of as permanent resident entrants, in fact, were temporary before that. So they might come as international students, as migrant workers with a path to permanent residence, or as temporary foreign workers that do not have a path to permanent residence, or as claimants, asylum claimants, or as visitors. Now, we tend to think, second, another important reason is that we tend to think that there are orderly ways for people to go from a temporary entry category to permanent residence and then to citizenship. If you look at the second, third, and fourth rows here in this figure, you can see some of that, right? People come, they get permanent residence, they can apply for citizenship. A refugee claimant comes, they're approved, they can become a permanent resident and a citizen. Of course, we just heard from Dr. Murray how this process can be quite challenging for SOGI claimants and for others as well. So we have this idea that it's all, kind of a clear pathway, and that for people who don't have a pathway to permanent residence, that they will work if they have a temporary permit and then leave, or if they're visitors, they'll do their visiting and leave. But in fact, things are much more complicated. This is a figure that I've developed with a colleague to describe what we've seen in our own research and through reading other people's work. It's people come in through various doorways and then things get complicated. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The real point of this picture is just to complicate the preceding one. So you can come in as a refugee claimant, but things may not work out, and then you're here without status. Or you can come in as a temporary worker And for a whole lot of reasons, which I can go into in the Q&A, you may become somebody without status. So at any given point in time, there are all of these temporary entrants, but there are also people who are without status. Third, another reason to be interested in these populations that are temporary, that arrive with temporary status, is that most research tends to focus on the official immigrants. So we just have less research on this population. Now, I'd like to share some data and some analysis from research that I did with a colleague from the U of T. And this is research that might appear a bit old, and in certain ways, certain aspects are out of date. The data were collected in 2006, but I've been doing research on this since then, and there are many ways in which these findings are echoed. We were looking to interview people from the Caribbean and Latin America who arrived in Canada, who had been in Canada for a couple of years, so that they had some work experience. We did not base our data collection and our sampling based on their entrance category, but we ended up with a sample of 300 people, and about 4 out of 10 arrived with permanent residence and the rest did not. In fact, about 45% arrived without work authorization, largely as visitors. So at the time of the survey, things had changed. Nearly 3/4 had permanent residence. And we became very interested in thinking about how different groups of people were working on getting permanent residence. What kinds of avenues were open to them, and were they trying to open up for themselves? Part of the reason that we were interested in looking at Caribbeans and Latin Americans was to try to get at some of the issues of race and racialization and how people from the Caribbean are seen in the Canadian context compared to people from Latin America. Now, the two main strategies that people were using, or the two main pathways that people were using, were the late refugee claim and an application for permanent residence based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. The humanitarian and compassionate grounds, or the H and C, is one option. The other is the inland refugee claim. And both of the other speakers have talked a little bit about this, so you have some sense of this. What I'd like to point out here is that people can claim asylum, can apply to be refugees at the border or once they're in Canada. And sometimes people learn that they are eligible to apply once they're in Canada. We heard this over and over from women in particular, who learned that the experiences of domestic violence or intimate partner violence that they'd experienced in their home countries made them eligible for protection here. So one thing that I want to point out is that claimants can receive some supports, not anything that allows people to live in a luxurious lifestyle at all, but there is state support, there's access to healthcare and some language training, and the possibility of applying for a work permit. In contrast, the application based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds does not offer that kind of support. However, it's really something that is best applied to by people who have children and who can demonstrate that they're part of a local community. So even though they may have been without status and trying to stay under the radar, the fact that they're involved in community organizations, a part of a community, their kids are in school, that all makes them more eligible for this. So now let me turn to our data. And here, this chart is looking at various pathways that people used in order, as part of their efforts to gain secure status. And I'd like to draw your attention to a few of these in particular. First, the late refugee claim. You can see that the two blue, this is Latin American men and Latin American women, those two paths are much more, this path is, let's say Latin Americans are overrepresented, both men and women, whereas Caribbeans are really not. But we see that this echoes the earlier path, which is the ever a refugee claim or the refugee claim on arrival. So Latin Americans were clearly much more likely to be making claims for refugee status, whether at arrival or once in Canada. The same was not true for Caribbeans, although Caribbean women did make some applications for asylum. If you look at the next set of bars here in the bar charts, the ever H and C, you can see that Caribbean women were much more likely to make an application based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. And then if you look at the last one on the right, this is people who combined the late refugee claim and humanitarian and compassionate applications. And here too, we see that Caribbean women are more likely to have done both. In fact, Caribbean men are not present here, and Latin American men and women are do so in much lower levels. So this shows us that these mechanisms are regionalized, and in this case, that also means racialized. Most of the Caribbean participants that we spoke with identified in one way or another as Afro-Caribbean, some were Indo-Caribbean, whereas the Latin Americans identified as mestizo, as very few indigenous self-identified participants. So we see these regionalized patterns with Latin Americans being more likely to apply for refugee status, and Caribbean women in particular more likely to apply for the H&C. We also see with the both bars that it seems that Latin Americans are learning and beginning to apply for the H&C. Now, I'm not going to spend time on outcomes. I can get to that in Q&A if people want. But what I want to point out is that with refugee claims, as David Murray has pointed out, as others have pointed out, some people are accepted, many people are not. And but I don't want to dwell on the outcomes here. What the slides don't tell us is how these patterns develop. And here I think we can draw on the previous two speakers to have a sense of how categories are constructed in certain ways. We have ideas about what kinds of refugees are real refugees. We have ideas about who should not be allowed to enter Canada as a refugee, as deserving of protection, spontaneous boat arrivals, for example. We have to look at how these historically informed ideas about refugee deservingness are formed. We also have to look at the changing laws and policies that tend to narrow the door and set up more barriers for who can be a refugee and who cannot. But I also want to draw attention to the work that Sean Rehag at the Center for Refugee Studies has done on looking at decision-making. And he really draws, refugee decision-making, he really draws attention to what he calls the luck of the draw. And that is that a lot of decisions seem to vary by the decision maker after controlling for applicants' countries of origin and so forth. So if you get, your decision may rest on your file, how good your documentation is, performances of sexuality and so forth, but it also depends on who your adjudicator is. And that's something that's very difficult to control. This isn't just a question of policy. In other words, it's also a question about how a range of actors that interact with refugee claimants and people applying on the basis of humanitarian and compassionate grounds, how those adjudicators and other actors understand who is deserving, and also the questions of how people are encouraged or discouraged from applying. In our interviews, over and over, we heard Caribbean respondents saying that they had been advised not to apply for refugee status because Caribbean countries were not refugee-producing countries. So the fact that anybody did from the Caribbean really shows their determination and their insistence that they deserve to be recognized as a refugee claimant. So there's social learning and so forth. People are learning that they can and should be entitled to apply. So again, I want to point to the importance of policies and the historical construction of policies in deciding who should deserve to be a refugee, who should not, who should deserve the exceptional opportunity to apply based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, and who doesn't. Then I want to step back and, I should add that Latin Americans, of course, were consistently encouraged to apply for refugee status once they were here in Canada by a range of people, from random taxi drivers to teachers to settlement workers, a lot of people. And this was true whether, even in cases where somebody might have had better, would also have qualified for a different point of entry. Now, all of these applications involve making oneself visible to the government from a situation of being without status. They all involve this kind of adjudication process that has very unpredictable outcomes. And preparation really helps, both for humanitarian compassionate applications and for late refugee claims. The unpredictability of the timing has led a colleague to write a paper that she titled, "I Can't Even Buy a Bed." And that's because it's so unpredictable. When you're in the refugee determination process, you don't know how long it'll last. You don't know when you'll figure out whether you can stay and be granted permanent residence. Time is suspended. For refugee claimants, they may have support while the process is going on. They do have support. For H&C applicants, they don't. They are deportable the whole time they're in the process. For everybody, there are expensive fees. The stories we heard about the amount of money people paid to legal consultants of various kinds was really astounding. And during this time, people are not investing in education. They're not investing in a series of other things that they could be because they need to supplement the support that they're getting, especially if they have families, or they need to work if they're not getting any support. And I really want to draw attention to the fact that in each of these processes, some are accepted and some are denied. Now, that may seem quite obvious now at this point, but when we look at refugee statistics, or when we read research on the experiences of refugees over time, we tend to be focusing on the people who were accepted. We're not looking at the people who were denied. Similarly with people without status who are applying for humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications. So some are denied. They may receive deportation orders. They may just go further underground and remain in Canada in other ways. And so it's worth thinking about that every process that is meant to include and protect also produces exclusion and leaves people vulnerable, may also leave people vulnerable. So I'd like to leave you with a few take-home messages. One is that these avenues, like the late refugee claim, humanitarian and compassionate grounds, can be racialized and gendered in ways that we may not fully understand. You've seen it clearly here with the context of, with the research on Latin Americans and Caribbeans. But this may happen in other ways, although this is also cross-cut by class and other social relations. Again, this idea that these adjustment mechanisms or these trajectories towards secure status include some and exclude others, and that exclusion is not always visible. But the unpredictability and of the outcomes, but also the unpredictability of how long people will be in these processes just means that people end up with lengthy and expensive processes. They're a resource sink in many ways, not just economic resources, but also the wasted talents and opportunities that people might have to exercise their profession and so forth. And the money really is something. And so I leave you with some of the questions that David Murray was addressing at the end, and Professor Kazimi as well, to think about, is this the kind of immigration and refugee system that we want? How do we want it to work? Do we want a system that excludes in these ways and includes in racialized and gendered ways? And as Professor Murray pointed out, what do we need to think about as policies that might alter the need for people to be in these kinds of situations? We can do more of this in the Q&A, but I will leave you with this, and just thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Goldring, for sharing your insights with us. At this point, I will ask all our speakers to turn their cameras and microphones on for the question and answer, Q&A, and panel discussion that we're going to have. I would like to invite members in our audience to submit any questions they may have for our speakers. If you're watching us on Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose your questions. We will be welcoming some members of our audience to ask their submitted questions live to our panel members, so keep an eye on your Q&A button for a prompt and instructions from our team. So I think I will start with the first question, and I think this was one particularly for Lewin, but others could answer. Is there any research or study on youth under 18 who come to Canada with student visa and applied for refugee claimants? What is the successful rate for this group that get their permanent resident status? And this was asked by Michelle Zhang.
That's a great question. Part of my answer is I don't know. It's a great question. I haven't seen, maybe my colleagues have seen research that specifically addresses this question. There is research on the status of parents and then youth experiences in the labor market. But what I am familiar with is research by close colleagues that looks at the experiences of people who arrive as part of a family that is claiming refugee status and their challenges around access to education. And it's a very interesting question because people in Ontario, young people have access to primary and secondary education. There is access for all, regardless of status at school. But when it comes to post-secondary education, that's a little trickier because they get charged as international students. So you may have somebody that arrives, goes to school, graduates from high school, their status is precarious, and then they want to go to university and it's very difficult. But in fact, York has a bridging program that helps to facilitate some of this access, but that doesn't address the fact that people aren't eligible for OSAP. So that's a bit of an indirect, not really sure, and a really good question kind of response.
Thanks, Dr. Goldring. Dr. Kazimi or Dr. Murray, do you want to say anything?
Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Kazimi.
Yeah, like Lewin, I'm not, I think it's a fantastic question. I think it really opens up a whole new area of investigation. I have not seen anything, any research along those lines.
Yeah, same here. The people I worked with were, there were some younger claimants, but they were all over 18. They were sort of, yeah, 19 and above. So yeah, I'm also not sure, and that's, again, just, you know, that's why that's a really great question, is if people are under 18 or if there is this legal age at which guardians are involved in refugee claims. So there would be other kind of complications arising from sort of youth claims that might be placed under family categories. So good questions. I would like to see more on that too. Yeah.
Yeah, go to the next question. And I think this could be a question answered by anyone. And I think there are a few questions coming for you about what to do and what are possible solutions. And so Eleanor O'Connor asked, would an IRB board with more than one adjudicator lessen the possibility of biased decisions? Isn't the single member board relatively new?
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Murray, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. There was a period, and Lewin can probably maybe better informed than I am, and I don't remember the exact period. There was a period in the earlier phases of the IRB where it was more common to have 2 board members or 2 adjudicators on a case. But that has, since I was doing the work in the mid 2010s, that was definitely not the case. And mainly it was due to just the sheer number of claims that are coming through and terrible backlogs. And again, as Lewin mentioned, you know, forcing some of these claimants to wait for years for their claim to come forward. So the board was shifting more to a single adjudicator kind of process. I think one of the other questions that comes up through that is, I'm not even sure if you did have 2 adjudicators, if that would change things. I think what's really important to find out more or to think about is the training of adjudicators and how they're trained to think about these claimants and where they're coming from and the categories that they're representing.
Dr. Goldring,
Yeah.
Kazimi, yeah, Dr. Kazimi, please.
Yeah, I think David raises a really important point, and that's what I wanted to say is we have to look at start with the selection process for the adjudicators, what is the pool they're drawn from. I have personally known a couple of adjudicators, and I've been surprised that they were chosen as adjudicators. Nothing in their background would suggest that they would be, even with training, that they would be able to jump to a point where they could literally decide someone's fate for the rest of their lives. And I think closely examining how these appointments are made is vital. At times, these appear to be patronage appointments on the parties in power. And at times they appear to be seemingly random, which leads to the randomness of the decisions that David talked about. That there is and as Sean has also mentioned his research, yes, it's like a lottery. You have no idea. There's no framework within which you can say, okay, I'm following these steps, and therefore I can predict the outcome to some degree. It just hasn't worked that way.
I would like to add a couple of things. I absolutely agree with my colleagues on the importance of thinking about the selection and training of adjudicators, but also thinking about the way the process and guidelines have changed over time. And the person with the question is absolutely right that it's gone from 2 to 1 adjudicator on the board that happened around 2002 with the change to the IRPA, the Immigration, Refugee and Protection Act, that introduced a whole bunch of other changes that made it much more challenging to apply for refugee status in Canada. And on the guidelines, at some points in time, this is no longer the case right now, but there were designated countries of origin that were considered countries that did produce refugees and others that were not on that list. And so that became a very practical shorthand, not really shorthand, but the way to decide. And just as an example, Mexico, which happens to be where I was born, has has never been considered a refugee producing country. And yet, as I think many of us know, there are many reasons why people might be in a situation where they feel they need to flee the country. And so at the moment, there's no official designated country of origin policy, but those have been there. And once there, they tend to inform how people operate. And those are these discursive ways of understanding who deserves and who doesn't, who should be, who shouldn't be. And that just adds a whole, additional layer of complexity to how it is that these decisions are happening and how it looks like, the sort of luck of the draw. And I would just suggest, if anybody is interested in some not so light reading, has anybody read Boat People? It's framed as a novel, but it's worth a read on these kinds of topics.
Thank you. So two more, I'm going to put two questions out there because again, it's about solutions. We've really focused on the adjudicator, but taking it the process. One question by Lynn Hope is, what do you suggest is the one solution to any of these issues surrounding, perhaps what would you think the best solution that could happen to help with some of these difficulties with immigration in Canada? And then another question from Peter, who asks, should Canada open up an avenue of immigration for so-called economic migration rather than force people to go through the onerous point system or the refugee board? So I think these are, again, this focus on what can we do, like what would be a good solution if you could pick one. And maybe we'll start with that one to all the speakers. If you could think of one intervention that could be done from your areas of expertise, what would be something that would be bang for your buck? If someone wants to start, I don't want to put someone on the spot, but anyone wants to start.
Sure, let me just wade right into this.
Yeah.
Sure.
Magic wand. If
I could wave a magic wand, I would absolutely reduce borders of all sorts, borders and barriers that we erect around the country, and not just the country, but globally, that are really meant to control who moves, how, when, and where. And that may sound like pie in the sky, but a more practical way of beginning to implement that kind of idea is along the lines of one of the questioners. They say open up for economic migration. I would take out the economic, because this distinction between economic and refugee is really pernicious. It just invites the idea that some people are real and deserving refugees and others aren't. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that there aren't situations where people need protection now and yesterday and the day before, but how we translate that into policy is a really delicate question. And by having a process that decides and categorizes people and sorts them into economic, non-economic, economic, political, economic, forced, that invites this kind of determination. So opening up avenues for permanent migration is sort of the shorthand for saying everybody who applies should be able to come with permanent status, without making people who are generally from the global south have to come through other channels. I'll leave it there.
Dr. Murray, Dr. Kazimi?
I just would want to echo Dr. Goldring's comments. I think that's an excellent way to sort of summarize a kind of overarching goal for reform. The refugee claimants that I worked with, they had arrived in Canada through various avenues, which Dr. Goldring's presentation sort of demonstrated. Some of them were students, some of them had come here and were, as refugee claimants, working very hard with temporary work visas in jobs that were quite difficult, but they couldn't move on to other kinds of training or education because they were stuck in this sort of limbo. And you just sort of increasingly see how these people who are desperately trying to find ways to support themselves, their families, their communities, are being forced into these categories that really end up sort of imposing particular assumptions on them, and some fit very well and they're successful, but I think, again, as Dr. Goldring pointed out in her presentation, we don't hear about the numbers who don't succeed or stuck in these limbos, these terrible times of waiting. And so I would just like to see, these categories in general seem to create more problems. And so shouldn't, and, there's just in the media this weekend, there's been some reports on, how desperate the Canadian government is for immigrants because, for a variety of reasons. And yet, so we hear that, but then we see what's being presented today in all these different ways in which, many people who are trying to get here are prevented or incarcerated or, stuck. So there is a structural problem there.
Thank you. Dr. Kazimi?
I think it's a really important question. I completely agree with Lewin and David, and I think Canada faces almost an existential crisis right now in terms of its birth rate. With a rapidly declining birth rate, the need for immigration becomes even more acute. This year and next year, we are on a sort of a recent record of allowing in over 400,000 refugees. The last time we got to those numbers was in 1905 when Canada was a country of around 8 million and 500,000 refugees had been, in 1913, half a million refugees had been allowed to come in. So I do believe that there's also a need to really examine precedented systems that have been an unspoken systemic approaches to refugees, or unwritten systemic approaches to refugees that are built into the system that have historical antecedents. Yeah.
We have a question from Michelle. And this actually relates to a different type of refugee that we haven't started, but I'm wanting your opinions on. So what changes are currently being considered to include climate refugees in our refugee system? Does anybody want to comment on that? Really important aspect that will become more and more.
I think we're already, so I've read a few interesting reports on how the Syrian civil war erupted as a result of climate. That there's indication of the impact of climate change in rural areas that forced young men into urban areas, and which led to political discontent and the explosion of an uprising against the ruling regime. And so in many ways we've seen the outcome of climate change, as is the growing so-called migration crisis for Europe, where people are becoming more and more impoverished in their, particularly in rural regions, and the evidence points to those changes happening because of climate change.
Would anybody else like to offer comments about climate refugees, how they fit in, and how they're being considered?
I don't have much. I'm not very knowledgeable about that specific category. I do think it just a reminder that has been made, I think, in all of these presentations that, there needs, of course, to be attention to the reform of our sort of policies and our practices around refugees. But we also, I think, need to be thinking about, refugees are the end point of a problem. And so often we're not considering what caused the refugee claimant in the first place. And so climate change is something for which, Canada holds a great deal of responsibility and has not been acting on in any sort of proactive or kind of organized way so far. So, what should we be doing to try and address climate change, that would hopefully reduce people, being forced to leave where they live because of climate change? I mean, those are, again, they seem to be pie in the sky, but I think they are all related kinds of questions.
Lillian, do you have anything?
Yeah, I would agree that it's really important to understand the factors and the complexity of the factors that lead people to leave, with climate change increasingly recognized as part of that process. And we could add others. I mean, we could add, extractive industries, Canadian investment in some of these extractive industries overseas. What I would be concerned about is trying to set up a new category that would have a new adjudication process. So, if there suddenly was climate refugees, is that necessarily the kind of addition we would want? Or would we add that to the grounds for determining that somebody is a legitimate refugee? I think it's really important to recognize those processes, but dealing with it by adding another ground may just exacerbate the kinds of issues we're talking about, as opposed to thinking about reforming policies more generally. So just kind of going back to the points that David and Ali were making before as well.
So another question actually comes in from an anonymous listener out there, and they're actually wanting to discuss this, what we were talking about as a panel about the idea of reducing or lowering or eliminating borders, and how this has to relate to how the work we're doing with Indigenous people in Canada and Indigenous people in North America and the use of borders. And so can you kind of comment about the idea of how this work with refugees and immigration can actually impact how we are getting reconciliation with the First Nations peoples of Canada? Anyone want to comment?
Well, I've one of the things I've historically in my work I've always pointed out is that this idea of the nation state that emerged didn't emerge simply as through immigration policies. I mean, while Canada was being imagined as a white Christian settler state, it was from both because of immigration as well as the ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples and their land, and these two processes have worked together in the creation of Canada as we know it today. And I think the question raised is a very important one, and really requires considerable thought. And I would also submit it requires an engagement with Indigenous communities on these issues, something that is not thought about. I was invited as part of a panel, the very last panel of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which drew upon people from racialized communities. And I remember saying that it took me, when I became a Canadian citizen, I realized that not only had I become a citizen of the state, but I had also become a treaty person, that I was, in a way, had been made complicit or responsible for the treaties that had been signed, of which, in terms of citizenship, no one's given any training for. I think it's changed now since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but in discussions with Indigenous peoples and thinkers, writers, artists, this issue of immigration, the idea of whether one is an immigrant or a settler or both, is much discussed. And I would say that we take a radical approach and we engage with Indigenous communities and bring them on as partners in discussing these issues, or the larger issues of having no borders. Because many Indigenous communities, in fact, all Indigenous communities have defined borders, and these borders are defined by the Indian Act. Right? So there's a border in terms of who belongs, who doesn't belong. That is again defined solely by the Indian Act. So I think the question is an interesting one, and it opens up the possibility of this kind of a broader holistic dialogue that engages with Indigenous communities as well, and to make them partners in this process.
Dr. Murray, Dr. Goldring, should like to add anything?
Go ahead, Lewin.
I really appreciate Dr. Kazimi's intervention there. I think it's really a really important question, and one that, you know, we settlers, immigrant settlers, should not be deciding unilaterally. So in a way, I don't think there's a possible decent answer to that in this kind of context. But what Ali is pointing to is the importance of recognizing that it's, you know, the reason we have the kind of migration system that we have has to do with the state, with the emergence of citizenship, all of that. We also hear this line of, we are here because you were there, right? That really points to colonial relations as in really contributing to migration of economic migrants, of refugees, of all sorts of people. But the other side of that is what the here is, and that is the dispossession of Indigenous lands, other than through treaties and some territories, reduced territories. So we have contending sovereignties, and Indigenous people don't really have control or aren't at the table when it comes to anything related to immigration. I don't have a solution other than pointing in the direction of these kinds of dialogues and recognizing that truth and reconciliation involves these questions of sovereignty and deciding who can be a guest on your land, who can be living on the land, and how they should be thought of. But where I take this, where I'm beginning to take this to heart in my own work, is thinking about how we teach migration courses, how we teach refugee courses. And, you know, 5-8 years ago, there wouldn't have been much discussion of anything to do with Indigenous issues, I think, in most courses. And that's something that's really beginning to be present in a number of courses that colleagues teach, that we're trying to think about, how do we really include these kinds of issues in terms of Canada and more globally. So it's a way of thinking about what little things, you know, we can do as part of the broader questions that need to be addressed.
Thank you. Dr. Murray?
Oh, I don't have much more to add. I just think of, I lived in New Zealand and worked at a university there for a year, quite a while ago. But what I found so interesting there was the way in which there were the conversations between the New Zealand Settler Society and the Maori, the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, were moving in a direction I think is quite different from how Canada has sort of operated so far. And there's lots of reasons for that, but what I did find so fascinating was how, based on the Waitangi Treaty, which is a sort of central treaty of relations between the government and the Maori peoples, it's resulted in every ministry, every government department in New Zealand has to have and must have a component that is sort of Maori affairs or of Maori interest in relation to whatever that department is, whether it's science, citizenship, education, health. And that has really, I think, I wouldn't say that, I don't want to speak for the Maori, but I think there's still many issues that are being dealt with there, but that speaks to me to the beginnings of the kinds of dialogues and conversations that both Lewin and Ali are referring to, and we're just nowhere close to that at this point here in Canada.
Yeah, I think everybody's talking about this idea of incorporating our immigration systems with Indigenous thoughts, Indigenous priorities. Actually, this whole work panel has been about, not Canadian enough. And I think, Indigenous people could just laugh at that question, and at the gatekeeping by, our systems, our colonial systems, about not Canadian enough and setting that agenda. There's a question from Sebastian, and I'm just going to read it out. Speaking about systemic approaches, there's an article by V. Seymour Wilson on multiculturalism that discusses preferred immigrants as a legal term. How is that idea of the preferred migrant being propagated in a different way today?
Well, the preferred migrant in many ways for and Canada has enacted this idea of the preferred migrant through its point system, and which has been continually refined. So in a sense, the system is designed to draw upon or to become the recipient of what is known as the brain drain from the global south, and there is a component of family reunification to it, something that was referred to in the last US election as chain migration, where a family comes in and they are, then they sponsor different members of the family to come in. But Canada has reduced that, has drastically reduced who can be sponsored in terms of family reunification. And the focus is entirely through the point system on preferred migrants. And it's got to do with various labor market studies, demand for professions, etc. But of course, as Loan has pointed out, is that once you come through that preferential system and are chosen to get through, there's a whole other set of gates that are there and hurdles for you to go through in terms of recognition of your credentials and so on. So yeah.
Dr. Maru, Dr. Goldring, do you want to comment?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. That connection between multiculturalism and the idea of a preferred immigrant. And there's a lot of work in sort of research on Canadian migration and sort of our multiculturalism policies, because Canada is, often claimed to be the first nation to take on multiculturalism as its sort of official definition of Canadian citizenship. And a lot of interesting critical research around that. And I think those two terms are really deeply linked, because multiculturalism is a particular way of talking about cultural diversity and immigration in Canada. And I'm thinking of a book, it's kind of, hold on, my memory is not great, that was written quite a while ago by an anthropologist named Eva Mackey called The House of Difference, Cultural Politics and National Identity in Canada. And it is a ethnographic, it's an investigation of, how multiculturalism sort of organizes immigrants to be the right kind of immigrant. It's a very delimited way about talking about difference and how Canada accepts, a particular kind of immigrant, and that's deeply classed and racialized and sexualized in all sorts of particular ways. So our multiculturalism policies, I think, inform our immigration policies. So they're deeply intertwined, and there's a lot of work, I think, to be done to think critically about multiculturalism itself as a sort of a national policy.
Thank you, Dr. Goldring.
If I can just add a bit, I think it's important. I'm going to leave the multiculturalism aside a bit, because I think David has spoken to some of the critical research on this, and and focus more on this question of preferred. And are we talking about people identified or considered preferred migrants or immigrants, right? Because we've seen in the context of COVID that in Quebec and some other provinces, governments are rushing to open avenues for permanent immigration for some deserving refugee claimants who have been working in certain kinds of occupations on the front lines. So we periodically open these small, narrow pathways for people who meet very stringent criteria to shift from essential workers to permanent immigrants. And I think it's worth keeping this in mind as we think about what is a preferred migrant or a preferred immigrant, because the preferred immigrant, who's going to be living here with access to citizenship may be quite different from the preferred migrant who might be considered a temporary worker and is fine as long as you have a very contained duration of stay, or if you can prove yourself through a probationary mechanism like live-in caregivers who have to complete certain amount of time, hours of work in a particular period and then apply. And for many reasons, people fall out of status in that process or have extended periods of temporariness. So let's clarify what we mean, preferred for what, under what terms. So just to complicate the question, which is a good question.
Thank you. There's a question, and I think it's again about really getting at the idea of changing how we shape policies about immigration. And this is a question from an anonymous audience member. Is there a lens that people who are racialized settlers who've come through the immigration system can have in the immigration system itself? Do you see any role for people who have actually come through the immigration system, racialized settlers, in improving the system?
I would say what's really impressed me in the past few years is seeing initiatives from our students and younger folks at the university in Toronto in Canada who are representing organizations like Idle No More and Black Lives Matter, who are really pushing for a radical rethinking of the whole variety of mechanisms of the state and its operations. And they are the ones who are in many cases leading conversations along with academics and other activists around some of the questions that have been raised today around the inclusion of Indigenous voices in various dimensions of our operations of the state, to immigration reform, to police violence. And that is coming from grassroots organizations that are racialized and queer and feminist. So that to me is in the midst of some pretty challenging times and perhaps a hopeful sign.
Dr. Goldring, Dr. Kazimi, yeah, please.
There are many racialized immigrants who are part of who are immigration officers, who are part of the system, as it were, but they're participants in the existing system. But as David has pointed out, there are these other groups that contest the system, that challenge the system. And one of the groups I would add to what David has pointed out is illegal. It's called Illegal No More. No one is illegal. Yes, no one is illegal, which has been a really important frontline organization for dealing with migrants of all kinds, specifically with temporary workers, and they've done remarkable work in terms of publicizing and pushing into public discourse the position of temporary farm workers in particular, but also around refugees and other kinds of migrants. And many of these activists are racialized migrants themselves. And I think, so one can't expect I think it's very difficult to join an existing system and as an individual and try to change it from within. Change tends to come when those systems are challenged from without.
And I would say that, well, no one is illegal. Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, MWAC, in Quebec, Solidarity Without Borders, their French acronym. In BC, there are organizations, I think, in Alberta, Migrante, which is a Filipino focused organization. There are a number of organizations, as David and Ali are saying, you know, that are led by and populated by racialized former or current migrants of one sort or another. And I think that's really I think we've seen an amazing expansion in terms of their networks with Indigenous organizing, the kind of thing that David and Ali are pointing to, but really a proliferation of these kinds of organizations and their networks. And they're, I think, in many ways at the front lines of expanding our ideas of what immigrant rights advocacy should be about, right? Not narrowly immigrant or migrant rights, but a broader conception of solidarity. And so is that a racialized lens? You know, maybe it's a call for involvement or at least attention to what these kinds of organizations are doing. Justicia for Migrant Workers would be another one. I mean, that it's really quite amazing in some ways the way the pandemic, by closing borders to refugee claimants and to a lot of migration, but nevertheless continuing to bring in temporary migrant workers, has created spaces for organizations to really work actively against a number of injustices, against overcrowding, against, you know, questions around isolation in the context of COVID and, you know, inability to social distance and so forth, right? These very challenging circumstances have, you know, at the same time created opportunities to network and to expand spheres of activity.
Anybody else? I actually have a question. I don't know when I'll get the expertise like this together again. And so I'm going to take advantage and use some nepotism and ask my own question here. We're talking about all these different, really about the refugee context where, you know, Canada's evaluating and there are life-threatening aspects to their life, bringing people in. Does Canada have a policy, or is there any data on people that they refuse refugee status, saying, well, maybe, you know, your life isn't really threatened, or I don't think you're actually living as an out gay person in your country, so your life isn't really threatened, etc., where they actually follow up once they've been engaged in Canada's system, what happens to the individual when they get sent back? Do we keep data? Do we know our mistakes?
I don't want to, I haven't specifically looked for that, but Lewin pointed out earlier that just the general lack of research, and you certainly see that in, you know, my specific area around sort of SOGI refugees. There's very little, apart from the occasional sort of news media item that focuses
anecdotal.
Anecdotal, that has like one example of, you know, I do remember a few years ago a case of one person who was deported because their SOGI application was rejected and they had to go back, I think it was to Grenada, a Caribbean nation, and were in having a very, very difficult time and actually went into hiding because of partially because of the publicity around the deportation and the coverage of it, which actually increased the sort of discussions about it back in their country, and you know, and was facing some massive challenges on many levels. But no, I really think this is one of the problems and oversights, both in the Canadian government, but also in the research itself, sort of approach to this, which is not really focusing beyond just some numbers of what happens to those who are deported or forced to return. And it's something I'm trying to follow up a little bit in my research right now, where I've done some work in Barbados, and I've met a few people who are who've returned, not always through forced, like official deportation, but they were stuck in different ways, or they gave up on their claim and they've gone back to Barbados. And in most cases, with the people I've interviewed, it's an incredibly difficult life that they return to, and there's just, without going into great detail, there's marginalization and silencing and visibility that creates some really difficult situations.
Dr. Goldring, Dr. Kazimi.
Yeah, there's certainly data, as David and I have mentioned before, and Ali have mentioned before, on acceptance and denial rates, right? So how many people were denied? But beyond
Curious
that,
about what happens to those people when they're
not what happens to them after.
Yeah.
And it's there's been a movie on people deported to Jamaica and a few other contexts. Do you remember the name of the movie, David?
No, I'm just Googling.
I was trying to look for it and I couldn't find it just now.
Yeah.
And there have been, I think Fifth Estate, there have been, various and certainly anecdotal and journalistic accounts of people, a couple of women who were deported to Mexico and were later found killed. There are these kinds of reports, but as far as I know, no systematic research. And of course, it would be difficult to do. But just as an example, there is quite a bit of research on people who have been deported to Mexico and to Guatemala. And that's research that's being done in those countries, and the experiences of marginalization, sometimes, some ability to work in call centers because you have English. If you've, grown up in the US, this is all largely deportation from the US to Mexico, Guatemala, some of these countries. And so, there are examples of that kind of research that could be done, but I'm not aware of systematic Canadian research on that. Good question.
Dr. Kazimi.
I have nothing really more to add, except that I know of, I've read anecdotal pieces on what happens, but I completely concur with David in knowing that there isn't that kind of research available.
And just I'd add the other, and again, it's from one person I interviewed for my research, which, again, is very kind of not focused on the people whose claims are not successful aren't always deported. They may disappear in the sense of staying here, but then sort of moving into this, non-status position. And again, there's that's very hard to track, but it's hard to research, but there could be substantial numbers of people who continue to work, under the table or living in very precarious ways, ongoing here in Canada. They actually haven't left. So, and which, is a whole another kind of precarity.
Thank you. I'm going to end on a comment, and it's actually just a movie recommendation from one of our listeners out there, from Gail. She wanted to thank you all for insightful presentations and wanted to recommend an Icelandic film called And Breathing Normally by Isolde Ugatotur in 2018. She just describes it as an immensely moving look at a woman refugee from Guinea-Bissau on the basis of sexual orientation, whose life interfaces with a border official who catches her. And the border official herself is an impoverished single parent trying to work her way out of homelessness. Shines light on the precariousness of women's refugee efforts and the precariousness of women with children at home. Riveting and also hopeful because of an act of resistance. So always good to hear back from some of our York Circle attendees to give recommendations both to panelists and to community members. I don't know if anybody's seen that movie.
I have,
Yes.
and I completely endorse that that review of the film, and I think it's a really important piece. Again, deeply humane, compassionate, empathetic, but also nuanced and complex. And it was one of my favorite films for 2018 in the festival circuit. Yes.
Great. Okay. I think that I will now turn it over to Carrie Williams for a few final housekeeping items before we say goodbye. Carrie, I want to extend my sincere thanks to you and the alumni engagement team for helping us kick off our first panel for the new academic year. It's been a wonderful and fascinating Sunday morning. I was really looking forward to listening and learning, and I have. And I'll turn it over to you, Carrie. Thank you again to all the speakers.
Wonderful. I echo that feeling. Thanks to Dr. Kazimi, Goldring, and Marie, and to yourself, Rebecca, Pillai Riddell. It's been such an enlightening and really critical conversation at sort of starting to unpack that notion of what Canada is. It really is a point in time, and this conversation and lecture was perfect. So thank you very much. You're welcome to leave your cameras on, or you can turn them off now. It's up to you. As in previous years, you've put together such thoughtful topics, and so definitely looking forward to the rest of the academic year with you. Thanks to all of you in the audience for taking the time to join us on a Sunday morning and participate in the Q&A. Before we end, we do have a survey that we're going to put in the chat for you. We're always looking for feedback, and we'd welcome you, if you wouldn't mind, checking out that survey. It will take you less than 5 minutes to complete and give us some feedback on your experience. As a reminder, the theme of the York Circle this year is "O Canada, the True North, Strong and Free, a historical journey through Canada's transgressions of individual and community rights." And we will be back for our second installment under this theme next month on Saturday, November 27th, with the topic Francophone in Canada, negotiating minority and majority rights. Our third session will take place on February 27th with the topic of enslavement in Canada. And following that, we'll hold our final session on June 4th with the topic around parenting while Indigenous. Registration is open for all of these sessions right now. You may register at any time by visiting the event section at yorku.ca/alumni and friends to secure your spot. Thank you so much for joining us again today and for the insightful conversation. We look forward to seeing you next month on the 27th. But until when, be well, and thank you very much.